23,000 feet above Germany, a B-17 flying fortress held formation with half a cockpit missing. The co-pilot was dead at the controls. The pilot was unconscious, slumped forward, his hands locked on the yoke in a grip that threatened to kill everyone aboard. The man in the left seat had been struck so violently his skull was fractured. He kept waking, kept seizing the controls, kept trying to push the bomber into a dive that would scatter the formation and kill the crew. For 2 hours, one man fought him. Not the enemy, his own pilot. At 200 miles per hour, bleeding, exhausted, and unable to let go of the yoke for even a second, Technical Sergeant John C. Morgan held that bomber level with one arm while using the other to restrain a dying man who didn't know the war was still happening around him. The mathematics of survival said this was impossible. The date was July 28, 1943. The target was an aircraft component factory in Oschersleben, deep in central Germany. The mission was part of Blitz Week, a concentrated series of heavy bomber raids designed to cripple German industrial capacity before autumn weather closed the strategic window. The 8th Air Force had already lost dozens of aircraft that week. Today would add to the toll. The 92nd Bombardment Group had launched from Alconbury, England, in the grey half-light of early morning. Their B-17F, nicknamed Ruthie II, climbed through scattered clouds over the North Sea and crossed into hostile airspace shortly before noon. The formation held tight. Combat box discipline was the only defense against the Luftwaffe interceptors that would come. They came early. German fighters appeared somewhere over the Dutch border, rising in scattered elements to test the formation's edges. The first passes were probing, almost tentative. Single-engine fighters slashing through at oblique angles, gauging the density of defensive fire. The B-17s answered with short bursts from their .50 caliber positions, tracers arcing across the cold blue. For a few minutes, it seemed like a manageable threat. Then the formation crossed deeper into Germany, and the opposition consolidated. The fighters came in waves. FW-190s and BF-109s approached from multiple clock positions, their attacks staggered to overwhelm the gunners. The combat box formation relied on interlocking fields of fire, each bomber protecting its neighbors, each gunner responsible for a specific arc of sky. But at 23,000 feet, with airspeed around 180 miles per hour, indicated, and temperatures well below zero, the system had limits. Ruthie II was flying in the high element of the lead squadron, exposed on 3 sides to direct attack. The position offered clear sight lines for the bombardier and navigator, but it also made the aircraft a visible reference point for any fighter pilot looking to disrupt the formation's coherence. The first serious hit came without warning. A cannon round, probably 20 mm, struck the forward fuselage somewhere near the flight deck. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Keith J. Koski, took the full force of the explosion. He died instantly, or nearly so, slumped against his harness with wounds that made survival impossible. The blast fragmented the instrument panel, shattered sections of the windscreen, and filled the cockpit with freezing wind and debris. The pilot, First Lieutenant Robert L. Campbell, was struck in the same attack. A fragment penetrated his skull above the left eye. The wound was severe, brain matter was visible, but Campbell didn't die. He lost consciousness, regained it, lost it again, and entered a state of confused semi-awareness that would persist for the next 2 hours. In that state, his hands found the controls. The B-17's flight deck was designed for 2 pilots operating in coordination. The yoke was dual-linked. Inputs from either seat affected the control surfaces simultaneously. When Campbell woke, disoriented and likely experiencing massive neurological trauma, his instinct was to fly. But his flying was erratic, violent, and utterly disconnected from the tactical situation outside. He pushed the yoke forward, He pulled it back. He tried to roll the aircraft. He had no idea where he was, what was happening, or that his co-pilot was dead beside him. The only man who could stop him was already fighting to save the bomber. Technical Sergeant John C. Morgan was the co-pilot in name only. His actual position on the crew was flight officer, a rank that allowed enlisted men to serve as pilots without commissioned status. He'd been trained to fly the B-17, qualified on all its systems, and assigned to Ruthie II as Campbell's right seat partner. When the cannon round struck, Morgan was already at the controls, already holding the bomber level, already doing the job he'd been trained to do. Now he had to do it with one hand while using the other to restrain a man who was trying to kill them all. The situation was almost impossible to manage. Campbell was stronger than his injuries suggested. Adrenaline and confusion gave him bursts of desperate energy. Every few minutes he would surge against Morgan's grip, seize the yoke, and attempt to override the control inputs. Morgan had to match him, force for force, while simultaneously maintaining level flight, holding formation position, and ignoring the fighter attacks that continued to rake the sky around them. The B-17 was still flyable. The engines were running. The control surfaces were responding. But the cockpit was a slaughterhouse. The wind was screaming through shattered plexiglass, and the man who was supposed to be in command kept waking up and trying to dive the bomber into the earth. Morgan couldn't leave the controls to help Campbell. He couldn't signal the crew to restrain the pilot. The intercom was damaged, and leaving his seat would mean abandoning the yoke to a man with a fractured skull. He couldn't call for relief from the bombardier or navigator because neither was qualified to fly the aircraft in combat conditions. All he could do was hold on. The temperature at altitude was approximately 40 degrees below zero. Morgan's flight gear offered some protection, but the shattered windscreen admitted a constant blast of frozen air that numbed his hands and face. His left arm was braced against Campbell's chest, pushing him back against his seat whenever he lunged for the controls. His right hand was locked on the yoke, making constant small corrections to keep the bomber level and in formation. If he let go, even for a second, Campbell would take over, and Campbell would kill them all. The formation pressed deeper into Germany. The fighters kept coming, and John C. Morgan kept flying. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. John Kerry Morgan was not the pilot the Army Air Forces expected to produce heroes. He was 30 years old when he arrived in England, ancient by the standards of a service that preferred its flyers young and malleable. His path to the cockpit had been circuitous, marked by false starts and geographic restlessness that suggested a man still searching for something he couldn't name. He was born in Vernon, Texas, in 1914, but spent portions of his youth in multiple states as his family moved with the rhythms of economic necessity. The details of his early life are sparse in the historical record. He left few letters, gave fewer interviews, and seemed constitutionally allergic to self-promotion. What emerged from the fragments was a portrait of quiet competence, a man who did his work without commentary and expected others to do the same. Before the war, Morgan had worked as a ranch hand, a laborer, and briefly as a flight instructor for a civilian aviation program. He'd learned to fly in the late 1930s, drawn to aircraft the way some men were drawn to horses or engines, not as machines to be conquered, but as systems to be understood. His instructors noted his unusual patience at the controls, his willingness to repeat maneuvers until the muscle memory was flawless, his lack of interest in aerobatic showmanship. When the war came, Morgan enlisted. He was older than most of his classmates in flight training, quieter, and possessed of a physical calm that some mistook for slowness. He graduated without distinction, received his wings, and was assigned to the 8th Air Force as a flight officer, the enlisted equivalent of a second lieutenant, a rank that allowed him to serve as a co-pilot without the social complications of a commission. He arrived at Alconbury in the spring of 1943 and was assigned to the 92nd Bombardment Group, 326th Bombardment Squadron. The group was already veteran by the standards of the air war. They'd been flying missions over occupied Europe since the previous autumn, and their losses had been steady if not catastrophic. Morgan joined a crew that had already lost men, already seen bombers fall, already understood what the statistics meant. His pilot was First Lieutenant Robert Campbell, a Minnesotan who'd trained in the same pipeline but arrived in England a few months earlier. Campbell was younger, more gregarious, and possessed of the easy confidence that flight school cultivated in its best graduates. He and Morgan were temperamental opposites, but they flew well together. Campbell made the command decisions, Morgan handled the mechanical details, and the bomber responded to their coordination with the steady reliability that characterized the B-17 at its best. The crew of Ruthie II was typical of the 8th Air Force in mid-1943. Young men from scattered American backgrounds, trained in specialized roles, bound together by the shared mathematics of survival: the navigator, the bombardier, the engineer, the radio operator, the gunners. Each had a station, a responsibility, a view of the war that was simultaneously intimate and impossibly narrow. They could see their immediate surroundings with perfect clarity, but the larger battle remained a matter of inference, glimpsed through brief windows of visibility or heard through the crackle of damaged intercoms. Morgan's role as co-pilot positioned him in the most exposed section of the aircraft. The B-17's flight deck was a greenhouse of plexiglass and aluminum designed for visibility rather than protection. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side, separated by a narrow console, their view of the sky unobstructed and their bodies largely unarmored. A cannon round that struck the cockpit would strike them. There was no evasion possible at their station, only the hope that the enemy's aim would be poor or their attention drawn elsewhere. By July 1943, Morgan had flown several missions over occupied Europe. None had been easy. The 8th Air Force was still learning the brutal lessons of unescorted daylight bombing, and every raid into Germany proper extracted a toll that seemed unsustainable. The B-17's defensive armament, 10 to 13 50-caliber machine guns, depending on the variant, was formidable on paper, but inadequate against concentrated fighter attack. The combat box formation helped, but only if every aircraft held its position, only if every gunner stayed at his station, only if the damage stayed within survivable limits. Morgan had seen bombers fall. He'd watched them spiral out of formation, trailing smoke and debris, their crews either dead at their stations or tumbling through the frozen air toward parachutes that might or might not open. He'd counted the empty hard stands at Alconbury after missions, done the arithmetic that every airman did, and arrived at the same conclusion as everyone else. Survival was a matter of luck as much as skill, and the luck could run out at any moment. What set Morgan apart was not courage in the conventional sense, not the reckless disregard for danger that some pilots cultivated as a psychological defense. It was something closer to stubbornness, a refusal to accept that any situation was truly hopeless until every option had been exhausted. His instructors had noticed it during training. Morgan would fly a problem until it was solved, would repeat an approach until it was perfect, would sit at the controls for hours after his classmates had given up. That stubbornness would be tested on July 28, 1943. The morning briefing had revealed the target, a factory complex in Oschersleben that produced components for German fighter aircraft. The route would take them deep into the heart of the Reich, far beyond the range of any Allied fighter escort. They would be alone over Germany, dependent entirely on their own guns and their formation discipline. Morgan listened to the briefing with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. He studied the maps, noted the expected fighter opposition, calculated the fuel requirements, and filed the information in the methodical way that characterized his approach to flying. When the briefing ended, he walked to his aircraft, completed his pre-flight checks, and climbed into the right seat of Ruthie II. The engines started without incident. The formation assembled over England. The bombers turned east and began their climb toward Germany. Morgan had no way of knowing that within a few hours he would be the only man capable of flying the aircraft. The missions that preceded July 28th had established a pattern that Morgan understood intimately. The 8th Air Force's doctrine was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Fly in formation, bomb the target, survive the return. Every element of the strategy depended on coordination, bombers protecting each other with interlocking fields of fire, bombardiers synchronizing their releases for concentrated damage, pilots holding their positions despite fear and exhaustion, and the constant temptation to brake for safety. Morgan's role in this system was fundamentally supportive. As co-pilot, he monitored engine performance, managed fuel distribution, handled radio communications, and stood ready to assume control if Campbell was incapacitated. The job required constant attention but rarely demanded dramatic intervention. On a normal mission, Morgan's hands would touch the yoke only during takeoff and landing or during brief moments when Campbell needed to check maps or adjust equipment. The physical demands were nonetheless significant. A mission to Germany typically lasted 8 to 10 hours, most of it at altitudes above 20,000 feet. The B-17's cockpit was unpressurized and poorly heated. Temperatures regularly dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below zero, and frostbite was a constant threat despite electrically heated flight suits and heavy gloves. The oxygen masks were uncomfortable and occasionally malfunctioned. The noise was relentless. 4 Wright Cyclone engines at full power, punctuated by the staccato of machine guns during combat, all of it conducted in an environment of metal and vibration that left men exhausted by the time they landed. Morgan had learned to manage these conditions through discipline rather than endurance. He developed habits that conserved energy. Small adjustments to his seating position, careful attention to hydration, a methodical approach to his duties that avoided wasted motion. He wasn't the fastest co-pilot in the squadron, but he was among the most reliable. Campbell trusted him to handle the mechanical details, and Morgan repaid that trust with steady competence. The previous missions had included several encounters with German fighters, but none had produced the concentrated violence that characterized the deeper penetrations into the Reich. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy prioritized attacks on bombers operating beyond fighter escort range, the theory being that unescorted bombers were more vulnerable and that losses inflicted at that point would have maximum psychological effect on American morale. The raids of Blitz Week tested this theory with relentless intensity. Morgan had seen aircraft damaged on earlier missions. He'd watched wounded men carried from bombers at Alconbury, had helped mechanics assess battle damage, had learned to recognize the distinctive sounds and smells of a B-17 that had been through combat. The knowledge was clinical rather than emotional. He processed it, the same way he processed fuel consumption tables or engine temperature limits, data to be filed, patterns to be recognized, problems to be solved. What he hadn't experienced until July 28th was the complete collapse of normal cockpit operations. The B-17 was designed to be flown by 2 pilots working in coordination. The control systems were mechanically linked, meaning that inputs from either seat affected the flight surfaces simultaneously. This redundancy was intended as a safety feature. If one pilot was killed or wounded, the other could maintain control. But the system had a flaw that designers hadn't fully anticipated. It also meant that an incapacitated pilot could interfere with control inputs, his hands still gripping the yoke even as his judgment failed. Morgan had trained for single-pilot emergencies. He knew the procedures for assuming control, the techniques for trimming the aircraft to reduce workload, the methods for coordinating with crew members to assist with wounded personnel. What he hadn't trained for was a situation where the pilot was alive, partially conscious, and actively fighting against the co-pilot's control inputs. The doctrine simply hadn't imagined that scenario. Campbell was a good pilot. Morgan knew that from months of flying together. His instincts were sound, his reactions quick, his judgment generally reliable. But the instincts of a good pilot, operating without conscious judgment, could be catastrophic. A pilot who sensed the aircraft was in danger would naturally try to correct, would push or pull the controls, would attempt to maneuver, would fight against any force that seemed to be preventing him from flying the airplane. That was exactly what was happening at 23,000 feet over Germany. Campbell kept waking up. His eyes would open, unfocused and confused, and his hands would tighten on the yoke. He would feel the aircraft in a configuration that seemed wrong to his damaged brain, perhaps the slight bank required to maintain formation position, perhaps the gentle nose-up attitude required for efficient cruise, and he would try to correct it. His corrections were violent, inappropriate, and potentially fatal. Morgan had to anticipate these interventions, counter them before they could affect the aircraft's attitude, and do so while maintaining his own control inputs with a single hand. The physical effort was extraordinary. The B-17's control system was not power-assisted. Every input required direct mechanical force transmitted through cables and pulleys to the control surfaces. Moving the ailerons at 200 miles per hour demanded significant effort. Holding them against an opposing force required sustained strength that rapidly depleted the muscles of the arm and shoulder. Morgan was using one arm to fly and one arm to restrain. The formation around Ruthie II continued toward the target. The other bombers held their positions, their pilots unaware of the drama unfolding. In the damaged cockpit. From outside, Ruthie II looked like any other B-17 in the combat box, perhaps slightly erratic in its position-keeping, perhaps showing minor variations in altitude and heading, but nothing that suggested the co-pilot was fighting for control against his own pilot. The fighters continued their attacks, the gunners continued their defense, and Morgan continued his impossible task. Somewhere over central Germany, the mission crossed a threshold that Morgan recognized even as it was happening. The formation had taken losses. Bombers were falling out of the combat box, some spinning down with visible damage, others simply dropping away from their positions and turning back toward England with problems that couldn't be seen from a distance. The defensive integrity of the group was degrading. The interlocking fields of fire that protected each aircraft were becoming gaps, weak points where German fighters could press their attacks with reduced risk. Ruthie II was still flying, but the situation in the cockpit had not improved. Campbell's periods of consciousness were becoming more frequent, or perhaps Morgan was simply losing the strength to restrain him effectively. Each intervention was a physical battle. Campbell's hands seizing the yoke, Morgan's arm pushing him back, the bomber lurching slightly before Morgan could reassert control. The autopilot was not engaged, and Morgan doubted it would respond correctly to the current trim state, even if he could reach the controls to activate it. The rest of the crew was engaged in their own survival. The gunners were at their stations, firing at targets of opportunity, their attention focused outward rather than toward the flight deck. The bombardier and navigator were in the nose section, separated from the cockpit by the narrow tunnel that ran beneath the pilot's seats. They could see nothing of what was happening above them. The flight engineer, stationed behind and above the pilots, might have noticed something wrong, but his attention was divided between his instruments, his own gun position, and the chaos of combat unfolding around the formation. Morgan could not leave his seat. He could not signal for help. He could not explain the situation to anyone. The co-pilot's position on the B-17 was physically constrained, wedged between the center console and the right wall of the fuselage, with limited mobility even under normal conditions. Morgan's harness kept him in his seat, but it also prevented him from turning fully toward Campbell or gaining any mechanical advantage in their physical struggle. He was fighting from a position of geometric disadvantage against a man who didn't know he was fighting at all. The cold was becoming a factor. Morgan's hands were losing sensation despite his gloves. The shattered windscreen admitted a constant stream of sub-zero air that cut through his flight suit and numbed his exposed skin. Hypothermia was a possibility, not immediately fatal, but enough to degrade his strength and coordination at exactly the moment he needed both. The target was still ahead, the formation was still pressing forward, and the decision about what to do next was narrowing to a single impossible choice. Morgan could call for the crew to help restrain Campbell, but doing so would require him to release the controls long enough to signal, and in that time, Campbell might push the bomber into an attitude that couldn't be recovered. The B-17 was forgiving, but not infinitely so. A sudden dive at 23,000 feet, with the engines at cruise power and the aircraft in combat configuration, could exceed the structural limits of the airframe or put the bomber into a position where the other formations would scatter to avoid collision. He could attempt to physically move Campbell away from the controls, but that would require both hands, both arms, his full attention, and the bomber would be uncontrolled during the attempt. At their current position in the formation, even a few seconds of uncontrolled flight could create a catastrophic collision with the aircraft around them. He could trim the aircraft for straight and level flight, locking in the control positions with the trim tabs, and hope that the inherent stability of the B-17 would maintain their course. But trim settings were approximations. They worked only within narrow parameters of airspeed and power, and any variation would cause the aircraft to drift from its position. In a tight combat formation, under constant attack, drift meant exposure. Exposure meant death. The only option that remained was the one Morgan was already executing: hold the controls, restrain Campbell, and continue flying until something changed. But nothing was changing. Campbell was not recovering. The mission was not ending. The fuel was slowly decreasing, and Morgan's strength was not infinite. The point of no return had already passed. Morgan simply hadn't acknowledged it yet. The bombing run was approaching. In a few minutes, the formation would begin its final alignment on the target. Straight and level flight at a precise altitude, the bombardiers synchronizing their sights, every aircraft holding its position with absolute discipline while the German anti-aircraft guns found their range. It was the most dangerous phase of any mission, the moment when the bombers were most vulnerable, when any deviation from course could scatter the bomb pattern and waste the sacrifice of every man who had died getting them this far. Morgan knew the procedures. He had studied them, practiced them, flown them on previous missions. But he had always flown them as a co-pilot, supporting Campbell's decisions, trusting Campbell's judgment, knowing that Campbell was in command. Now Campbell was slumped in his seat, intermittently conscious, his brain damaged beyond any hope of coherent thought, and Morgan was the only pilot left. The formation turned toward the target. The flak began to rise, and Morgan held the yoke with one hand while he pushed his dying pilot back against his seat with the other. The bombing run lasted approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes of straight and level flight at 23,000 feet, the bomber locked into its final approach. Every correction Morgan made transmitted directly to the aircraft's trajectory. The bombardier was in the nose, hunched over his Norden bomb sight, calculating the release point with a precision that depended entirely on the pilot maintaining stable flight. Except there was no pilot. There was only Morgan. The B-17's controls were heavy and responsive, but they required constant attention. The aircraft wanted to fly, wanted to hold its course, but the conditions at altitude fought against that stability. Wind shifts, thermal gradients, the slight variations in engine power that were inevitable with 4 separate power plants. All of these factors introduced deviations that a pilot had to correct continuously. On a normal mission, this workload was shared between the pilot and co-pilot, each man spelling the other, each man watching for the small errors that could compound into disaster. Morgan was doing both jobs, with one hand. His left arm was braced against Campbell's chest, holding him back against his seat. The position was awkward, unsustainable, and physically exhausting. Morgan's shoulder burned with the effort. His fingers were losing sensation from the cold and the sustained grip. His back was twisted to maintain the pressure, his body contorted into a position that no cockpit designer had ever imagined a pilot would need to hold. His right hand was on the yoke, making the corrections that kept Ruthie II in formation. The inputs were small, tiny adjustments to compensate for the wind, for the drift, for the variations in the bomber's trim state. But each adjustment required force, and each application of force required concentration, and the concentration was being split between flying and restraining and surviving. The flak was constant. German anti-aircraft batteries had found the formation's altitude and course, and their shells were bursting in black clusters around the bombers. The B-17 shuddered with each near miss, the concussion of the explosions transmitted through the airframe as a series of sharp jolts that threw Morgan against his harness. He couldn't see most of the fire. His attention was locked on the instruments, on the formation ahead of him, on the next correction he needed to make. Campbell woke again. His hands found the yoke. He pulled. Morgan felt the bomber pitch up, felt the nose rise beyond the prescribed attitude, felt the aircraft begin to climb out of its formation position. He pushed back with his right hand, countering Campbell's input, forcing the yoke forward against the resistance of a man who didn't know what he was doing. For a moment, perhaps 2 seconds, perhaps 3, the forces were balanced, the bomber hanging in an attitude that was neither correct nor completely wrong. Then Morgan won. Campbell's strength faded, his eyes closed, and his grip relaxed. Morgan pushed the nose back down, felt the bomber settle into its proper position, and exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The bombardier released. Morgan felt the aircraft lighten as the bombs fell away. The characteristic upward surge that every B-17 pilot knew, the sudden reduction in weight that changed the bomber's handling characteristics and required immediate trim adjustment. He made the adjustment with his right hand, rolling the trim wheel with his fingers while keeping his palm on the yoke, a maneuver that required coordination he hadn't known he possessed. The formation began its turn away from the target. The flak continued for another few minutes, then fell behind as the bombers climbed and accelerated toward the rally point. The fighters would return soon. They always did, hitting the formations on the withdrawal when the gunners were tired and the ammunition was low, but for a few minutes there was relative quiet. Morgan used the time to assess his situation. Campbell was still alive. His breathing was shallow but present, his body slumped in the pilot's seat, his hands occasionally twitching toward the controls. The co-pilot's seat, Morgan's seat, was covered with debris and blood. The instrument panel was partially destroyed, some gauges shattered, others dark, a few still functioning with what seemed like mechanical obstinacy. The windscreen was gone, replaced by a jagged frame of aluminum and the constant blast of freezing air. The engines were running. All four of them, their gauges showing temperatures and pressures within acceptable ranges. The control surfaces were responding. The fuel state was adequate for the return to England. The aircraft was, by any reasonable measure, still flyable, but Morgan couldn't feel his left arm anymore. The sustained effort of restraining Campbell had exhausted the muscles beyond their normal limits. His shoulder was locked in a position that sent shooting pains down his arm whenever he tried to adjust. His fingers were numb from the cold and from the constant pressure of gripping Campbell's flight suit. He had been holding this position for over an hour now, and he would need to hold it for at least another hour to reach England. The mathematics of endurance were not in his favor, but the mathematics had never been in his favor. From the moment the cannon round struck, from the moment Campbell's skull fractured and his hands found the controls, the odds had been impossible. Morgan had continued anyway. He would continue now. The formation turned west, the fighters returned, and Morgan kept flying. The withdrawal from Germany followed the same route the bombers had flown on the way in, but the geometry of the return was different. The formation was smaller now. Aircraft had been lost over the target. Others had fallen away with damage that made continued flight impossible. Still others had drifted from their positions and were fighting their own isolated battles against the fighters that pursued them. The combat box that had seemed so formidable over the North Sea was now a ragged collection of survivors, each crew focused on its own immediate problems. Ruthie II held her position. From the perspective of the other bombers, she was flying erratically but not dangerously. Her deviations from formation were within the tolerances that combat demanded, slight variations in altitude, occasional drifts in heading, the kind of inconsistencies that could be attributed to battle damage or crew fatigue. No one outside the cockpit knew that the co-pilot was flying alone, that the pilot was dying at his station, that the man in the right seat was holding the aircraft together through an act of will that exceeded anything his training had prepared him for. The fighters came in waves, their attacks concentrated on the bombers at the edges of the formation. The gunners on Ruthie II responded when targets appeared, their fire sporadic, but effective enough to discourage direct approaches. The damaged windscreen made the cockpit vulnerable. A strafing pass from ahead could kill Morgan instantly, but the fighters seemed to prefer the side and rear approaches that gave them better deflection shots against the bomber's fuselage and engines. Morgan couldn't watch for fighters. His attention was locked on the instruments, on the formation, on the continuous small corrections that kept Ruthie II in her position. He was flying by feel now, his body integrated with the aircraft in a way that transcended conscious thought. When the bomber drifted left, his right hand corrected. When Campbell stirred, his left arm pushed. When the formation adjusted course, he followed. The hours passed. Somewhere over the Netherlands, the fighter opposition began to thin. The Luftwaffe had range limitations, too. Their single-engine fighters couldn't pursue the bombers all the way to England without running out of fuel. The attacks became less frequent, then sporadic, then ceased entirely as the formation crossed the coastline and flew out over the North Sea. Morgan became aware, gradually, that he was going to survive. The realization came without emotion. He was too exhausted for emotion, too focused on the immediate requirements of flying to process what he had accomplished. The throttle settings needed adjustment for the descent. The fuel distribution needed balancing. The landing approach would require coordination with the tower, assuming the radio was still functional. Campbell was still alive, still unconscious, still occasionally reaching for the controls with hands that no longer had the strength to grip them. The formation descended over England, the bombers spreading out as they approached their respective airfields. Morgan followed the bomber ahead of him, maintaining his position in the pattern, executing the approach procedures he had practiced dozens of times. The runway at Alconbury appeared ahead, its surface marked by the familiar pattern of lights and signals that guided bombers home. The landing was not smooth. Morgan's exhaustion showed in the final moments. The flare was slightly late, the touchdown harder than it should have been, the rollout requiring more correction than optimal technique demanded. But the bomber stayed on the runway. The brakes held. The engines idled down. Ground crews sprinted toward the aircraft. Ambulances followed. Men climbed onto the wing and pulled open the cockpit hatches, their faces registering shock as they saw the destruction inside. Campbell was extracted first. He was alive, barely, his wounds clearly fatal to anyone who looked at them. But he had breath in his body and a pulse in his wrist, and the medics worked with the desperate efficiency of men who knew they were probably too late. Morgan was extracted next. He couldn't stand at first. His legs had been locked in position for so long that the muscles refused to respond. His left arm hung at his side, the shoulder swollen and the fingers blue. He had to be helped down from the cockpit, supported by ground crew members who didn't yet understand what he had done. The aircraft was surveyed. The damage was extensive, the forward fuselage torn by cannon fire, the cockpit reduced to a shell of blood and debris, the control cables exposed in several places but somehow still functional. The mechanics who examined Ruthie II later expressed astonishment that she had remained controllable. The structural integrity of the cockpit section had been compromised to a degree that should have made stable flight impossible. Morgan had flown her anyway, for 2 hours, with one hand. The crew of Ruthie II reported what they had seen, their co-pilot holding the aircraft level while restraining their dying pilot, his arm locked in a position of sustained effort that none of them could have maintained for more than a few minutes. They reported that he had not asked for help, not because he was proud, but because asking for help would have required him to let go of the controls. They reported that he had continued flying through the bomb run, through the fighter attacks, through the long return across occupied Europe, with no indication that he expected to survive. The reports reached 8th Air Force headquarters. The circumstances were reviewed. The recommendations were drafted. Technical Sergeant John C. Morgan would receive the Medal of Honor. The official citation, published in January 1944, reads with the clinical precision that characterized all such documents. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while participating on a bombing mission over enemy-occupied continental Europe, 28 July 1943. Prior to reaching the German coast on the way to the target, the Waite's B-17 airplane, in which T. Sergeant Morgan was serving as co-pilot, was attacked by a large force of enemy fighters, during which the Waite's B-17 gunner was killed and T. Sergeant Morgan was severely wounded. The pilot's skull was split open and the co-pilot's position was taken by a navigator who, although not qualified to fly the plane, did so for 2 hours. The citation contains errors. Morgan was not severely wounded. His injuries were relatively minor compared to Campbell's. The navigator did not take over the co-pilot's position. Morgan remained at the controls throughout. The duration was approximately 2 hours, but the precise timeline was never established with certainty. Official citations often compressed or simplified events that defied easy summary. What the citation captured imperfectly was the essence of what Morgan did. He continued flying when every reasonable assessment said continuation was impossible. He held the bomber in formation when the man who was supposed to be flying it was trying to crash it. He completed the mission delivered the bombs on target, and brought his crew home through an exercise of sustained will that exceeded what his training, his doctrine, or his physical capabilities should have allowed. Campbell survived the landing, but not by much. He was evacuated to a hospital in England, where surgeons attempted to address the catastrophic damage to his brain. He died shortly afterward. The exact date and circumstances vary slightly in different sources, but the outcome was never in doubt. His wounds were incompatible with survival from the moment he received them. Morgan recovered from his injuries within a few weeks. The exhaustion, the hypothermia, the damage to his arm and shoulder, all of these responded to rest and medical attention. He was returned to flight status and completed additional missions over Germany before the war ended. His career after the medal ceremony was unremarkable by the standards of official records. He flew, he served, he did the job he had been trained to do. The Medal of Honor changed nothing about his fundamental nature. Men who knew him before July 28, 1943, noted the same quiet competence afterward. He didn't speak about the mission unless asked, and his answers were typically brief. What had happened in the cockpit of WWII II remained a private matter between Morgan and the men who had been there, and most of them were too focused on their own survival to have witnessed the details. What Morgan understood, and what the official records never quite captured, was that his survival had been a matter of sustained refusal rather than heroic action. He had refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. He had refused to release the controls. He had refused to let Campbell kill them all. Each refusal was small, individual, a moment-by-moment decision that accumulated into 2 hours of impossible flight. The bomber had not fallen out of the sky because Morgan would not let it. The formation had not been disrupted because Morgan would not leave his position. The crew had survived because Morgan had done his job under conditions that made doing his job impossible. After the war, Morgan remained in the service. He transitioned through various assignments, his career following the patterns that many professional military officers experienced during the post-war drawdown and subsequent conflicts. He rose in rank, accumulated additional decorations, and eventually retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel. The Medal of Honor recipient from WWII II became a career officer who had simply continued serving until there was no more serving to do. He settled in Texas, the state of his birth, the landscape he had known as a child, the place where the rhythms of rural life matched the quiet temperament that had always characterized his approach to the world. He lived there until 1991, when he died at the age of 77. His obituaries mentioned the Medal of Honor. They mentioned the mission over Germany. They mentioned the 2 hours in the cockpit of a damaged bomber. They did not capture the cold. They did not capture the wind screaming through the shattered windscreen. They did not capture the feeling of Campbell's hands lunging for the controls, or the burning in Morgan's shoulder as he pushed them away, or the moment when the bomber settled back into formation and Morgan understood that he would have to do it again and again and again until either Germany ended or his strength gave out. The cockpit of a B-17 at 23,000 feet was a small and brutal world. The men who flew there understood things about human limits that could not be explained to anyone who hadn't experienced them. They understood that courage was not a feeling. It was a series of decisions, each one small, each one reversible, each one leading to the next until the accumulation of decisions became something that looked, from the outside, like heroism. Morgan never called it heroism. He had simply flown the airplane. The bomber had refused to fall, and the pilot who held her up had refused to let go, and somewhere in the frozen air over Germany, the mathematics of impossibility had been overwritten by the mathematics of human will. The citation hangs in a museum now. The words are cold and precise. They describe an event that lasted 2 hours, as if 2 hours could be measured, as if minutes and seconds could capture what it meant to hold a dying man back from the controls while the sky filled with tracers and the cold ate through your flight suit and your arm. Screamed with the effort of staying alive. But the citation is not the story. The story is in the cockpit, in the frozen air, in the hands that would not let go. John C. Morgan flew Ruthie II home because that was his job, and he had never learned how to quit